Little girl pulled his jacket crying, "She's bleeding bad." The biker's response silenced all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a cold, dark evening, with the wind howling through the narrow streets as Jack Reaper Morrison, a seasoned Hell's Angel, sped down a deserted road on his Harley-Davidson. The road was desolate, far from the city, where only the harsh hum of his motorcycle cut through the silence of the night. Jack had seen it all in his life: violence, betrayal, and loss, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a shift, an unease that he couldn't quite place. As he neared the curve ahead, his ears perked up. He thought he heard something, a cry, faint but unmistakable. He slowed his bike, scanning the darkness. The sound came again, a soft whimper, barely audible over the roar of his engine. Without a second thought, Jack pulled over, the gravel crunching under his heavy boots as he jumped off the bike. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Then he saw her, a young girl, no older than 10, stumbling toward him. Her clothes were ragged, her face pale, and blood dripped from a deep wound on her leg. She was pulling herself toward him with trembling hands, her tiny body shaking from both fear and pain. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet filled with desperation. She reached for him, clutching the sleeve of his jacket. "She's bleeding bad." The words hit Jack like a freight train. His hardened exterior, built over years of riding with the Hells Angels, shattered in an instant. He could feel his heart racing. This wasn't the usual mess he dealt with. This wasn't a rival club member or a thug in need of a beating. This was a child, scared and hurt, standing in front of him with nowhere to turn. Jack kneeled down slowly, careful not to scare her, his hands steady despite the rush of emotions flooding him. "It's okay, kid. You're gonna be fine," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, considering the years of gruffness he had accumulated. The girl flinched, looking up at him with wide, fearful eyes. She didn't trust him. Who could blame her? To her, Jack probably looked like a monster, tall, scarred, with tattoos that screamed danger. But there was something in her eyes that made him forget everything: her pain, her innocence, and the need for help. Jack carefully took off his jacket and draped it over her small, shivering body. He knew the situation was urgent. Her leg was badly injured, but he couldn't tell how deep the wound was. He had no medical training, but he had to do something. "Hold on tight, sweetheart. I'll get you somewhere safe," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. She nodded weakly, and Jack carefully lifted her, feeling the weight of her small body in his arms. As he walked toward his bike, he could feel her tiny hands clutching his jacket. The air was cold, but it wasn't the chill in the air that made him shiver. It was the weight of what he was about to do. He wasn't just taking her to safety. He was going to face whatever danger lay ahead to make sure she got the help she needed. There was no turning back now. As Jack carefully placed the girl on the back of his Harley-Davidson, the rain began to fall heavier, drenching them both. The cold drops mixed with the blood on her leg, making it even harder to ignore the severity of her injury. He could feel her trembling against him, her small hands clutching his jacket tightly, as if afraid to let go. Jack revved the engine, his mind racing. He knew he had to get her to safety quickly, but the nearest hospital was miles away, and with the storm picking up, the roads would be treacherous. He glanced back at her, trying to give her a reassuring smile, though deep down, he wasn't sure how reassuring it really was. He had never been good at comforting others, but this was different. This was a child, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt something stir within him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. Maybe it was guilt. The guilt of all the people he couldn't save in his life. The people he had turned his back on, including children. As they sped down the highway, Jack's thoughts flashed back to a time many years ago, when he had been a different man, or at least he had tried to be. He had once been a protector, someone who would stand up for the weak and the helpless. But that had been before the club, before the violence and betrayal, before the life he had built had been shattered. The sound of the rain beating against his helmet brought him back to the present. He focused on the road ahead, steering carefully as the wind whipped around them. The girl's breathing was shallow, and Jack could feel her growing heavier in his arms, almost as if she were slipping away. His mind raced as he tried to think of something to say, anything to reassure her. But there were no words. His hands gripped the handlebars tighter, and his knuckles turned white. He wasn't used to feeling so helpless. There had been so many times in his life when he had been in control. So many situations where he had been the one calling the shots. But this was different. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had never had to care for anyone like this. As they approached the small diner on the outskirts of town, Jack pulled off the main road and into the parking lot. The place was dimly lit, with only a few cars parked outside, but it was the closest refuge he could find. He parked his bike and carefully lifted the girl off, her weight a reminder of how vulnerable she was. Her face was pale, her eyes half closed from exhaustion and pain. "Stay with me, sweetheart," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice thick with emotion. He could see the diner's neon sign flicker in the distance, and he knew he had to get her inside, away from the cold and the storm. He made his way to the entrance, pushing the door open with his foot. The bell above the door rang, announcing their arrival, but the place was empty except for the elderly waitress behind the counter. She looked up at them, her eyes widening at the sight of the injured girl in Jack's arms. "What happened?" she asked, rushing toward them. Jack didn't have time to explain. "Call for an ambulance, now," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. The waitress didn't hesitate. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she spoke with the dispatcher. Jack moved quickly, laying the girl down on one of the booths and gently removing her jacket to inspect her injury. The blood was still flowing, but it wasn't as bad as he had feared. The wound was deep, but not life-threatening if treated soon. Jack looked around the diner for anything he could use to stop the bleeding. He spotted a clean towel on the counter and grabbed it, pressing it to the wound. "Hang in there, kid," Jack whispered, his voice cracking. As the minutes passed, the storm outside raged on, but Jack didn't move from the booth. He didn't care about the rain, or the fact that he was drenched to the bone. He only cared about her. Her life was in his hands now, and he wasn't going to let her slip away. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, the sound of sirens broke through the storm, and the paramedics arrived. They rushed in, assessing the situation quickly. One of them spoke to Jack. "You did the right thing, getting her here," he said, his voice calm and professional. "We've got her from here." Jack nodded, stepping back as the paramedics worked. As they loaded the girl into the ambulance, Jack felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. She was going to be okay. For now. As the doors slammed shut and the ambulance sped away, Jack stood there, watching it disappear into the night. His hands were still shaking, but now, there was something else inside him. A sense of something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a cold, damp chill that hung heavy in the air. Jack stood outside the small diner, his eyes tracing the red lights of the ambulance as it sped away, carrying the little girl to safety. The night felt oddly still, as if time itself had taken a pause. Jack's mind was racing, but there was one thought that kept repeating itself. He had saved her. She was safe. For now. He shook his head, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another job. This was personal. Jack turned back toward the diner, his leather jacket still damp from the rain. He was about to walk in when he noticed a car pulling up to the curb. It was a nondescript sedan, and the driver looked familiar. The man stepped out, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but Jack recognized him instantly. It was Rick, one of the guys from his old crew. Rick had been a part of the club for years, but Jack hadn't seen him since he'd left. He knew Rick was still involved with some of the more dangerous activities the club had been into, and his sudden appearance was more than a coincidence. Jack tensed, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't sure why Rick was here, but he had a feeling it wasn't just to check on the girl. He watched as Rick made his way toward the diner, the click of his boots on the pavement echoing in the silence of the night. Jack's hand instinctively went to his waistband, checking for the weight of his gun, but he knew he wasn't looking for a fight. Not tonight. He was tired. Tired of the violence. Tired of the life he had left behind. But Rick wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer. Jack stayed where he was, watching as Rick entered the diner. A few moments later, he followed. Inside, the warmth hit him like a wave, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and greasy diner food filled the air. Rick was sitting at the counter, speaking with the waitress. When Jack entered, Rick looked up, his eyes narrowing for a brief moment before a grin spread across his face. "Jack," Rick said, his voice dripping with familiarity. "Long time no see." Jack nodded, stepping toward the counter. "What are you doing here, Rick?" he asked, his tone flat. Rick's grin faded slightly, and he shrugged. "Just passing through," he said. "Had some business in town. Thought I'd stop by, see how you were doing." Jack raised an eyebrow. He didn't buy it. Rick was never the type to just pass through anywhere. He had a job to do, and Jack had a feeling it had something to do with the little girl. "I'm not interested in your business, Rick," Jack said, his voice cold. "But I will tell you this, stay away from the girl. She's been through enough tonight." Rick leaned back in his seat, eyes scanning Jack's face. "You always were a soft one, Jack," he said, his voice low and mocking. "You think you can just waltz in here, play the hero, and walk away without consequences?" Jack felt the tension in his shoulders tighten. "I'm not playing any hero," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just doing what's right." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Doing what's right," he repeated. "You've been doing what's right for the wrong people your whole life, Jack. The club doesn't care about your moral compass. You've crossed the line too many times to think you can just walk away." Jack stood still, his heart racing. He had known this day would come, the day when his past would catch up with him. But he didn't expect it to be tonight. And certainly not over a child. "You don't get it, Rick," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "I'm done. I'm not going back to that life. Not for you. Not for anyone." Rick's eyes darkened. "You think you can just walk away from the club like that? You think you can just save a kid and suddenly be a saint? You're either with us, or you're against us. And you know what happens to people who turn their backs on the club." Jack knew the threat was real. The Hells Angels didn't take betrayal lightly, and Rick was one of the last men Jack wanted to have as an enemy. But Jack wasn't going to back down now. "I've already turned my back on the club, Rick," Jack said, his voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of you or anyone else. You tell them that." Rick's grin returned, but it was cold, menacing. "You'll regret this, Jack. You'll see. No one walks away from the Hells Angels. Not without a price." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't care about the price anymore. He had already paid enough. As Rick left the diner, Jack stood there, watching him disappear into the night. He knew this wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a sense of peace. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Rick, stand in his way now. The girl was safe, and that's all that mattered. The next few days passed in a blur for Jack. The girl, whose name he had learned was Emily, was recovering at the local hospital. She was lucky. The doctors had told Jack that the wound on her leg, though deep, was not life-threatening. But it wasn't just the physical injury that weighed on him. Emily had been through something far worse than just the pain in her leg. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in a world that had already taken so much from her. Jack had seen that kind of darkness before, but never in someone so young. He couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't shake the image of her small, bloodied body clinging to him in desperation. Despite the relief that she was safe for now, Jack felt a heaviness in his chest. He was still stuck in a battle with his past, a battle that seemed never-ending. After the confrontation with Rick in the diner, Jack knew there was no turning back. He was no longer part of the Hells Angels, but he wasn't exactly free either. The club didn't let anyone go that easily. And then there was the message Rick had left him. "You'll regret this. You'll see. No one walks away from the Hells Angels. Not without a price." Jack couldn't ignore the threat. He knew the club's code well enough to understand what that meant. The Hells Angels didn't take betrayal lightly. But right now, his focus had to be on Emily. She was the only thing that mattered. Jack visited her every day, sitting by her bed while she rested, talking to her when she was awake. She wasn't much of a talker, but she always seemed to appreciate his presence. And though Jack never showed it, he could feel a bond forming between them, something he hadn't felt in years. Emily had no family, no one to claim her. Her parents were gone, and her aunt, who had been her legal guardian, had disappeared without a trace. The authorities had no leads, and Emily had no answers. It was as if she had been left to rot, abandoned in a world that had forgotten her. Jack wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. He couldn't just leave her. He had no idea what kind of life she would have without someone to guide her. But what could he offer her? He wasn't exactly a role model. He had spent years living a life of crime, a life that had led him down a dark path. He had nothing to offer her but a broken past. But he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave her alone in a world that had already shown her how cruel it could be. As the days passed, Jack found himself growing more attached to her. He started bringing her small gifts, a stuffed animal, a comic book, anything to make her smile. And it worked. Slowly but surely, Emily began to open up to him, telling him stories about her life before everything fell apart. She wasn't angry, not like he had expected. Instead, she seemed resigned, as though she had learned to live with the pain. But there was something else in her eyes, something that Jack couldn't quite figure out. It was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jack found himself visiting her even more, staying with her late into the evening, talking about anything and everything. He couldn't remember the last time he had spent so much time with someone without feeling the need to guard himself. She had a way of making him feel human again. It was strange, feeling this connection to her. It was the kind of bond that he thought he had lost long ago, buried beneath years of violence and betrayal. But somehow, she had brought it all back to the surface. One evening, as Jack sat by Emily's bed, the door to her hospital room opened. A man stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Jack's instincts went on high alert. The man was no stranger. He had seen him before, in the shadows, during the days when he had still been involved with the Hells Angels. This was a club member, someone who still had ties to the gang. Jack stood up, ready to defend Emily if necessary. But the man didn't seem threatening. He looked at Jack for a moment, then turned his attention to Emily. "She's doing well," the man said, his voice low and calm. Jack didn't speak. He was sizing the man up, trying to figure out what his presence meant. The man seemed to sense Jack's hesitation. "Don't worry," he continued. "I'm not here to hurt her." Jack's muscles tensed. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cold. The man met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm here to make sure she's safe. We don't want any more trouble, but we also don't want anyone forgetting who's in charge." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He knew exactly what the man meant. The Hells Angels were never far from anyone who had been part of their world. Jack had learned that the hard way. But right now, the only thing that mattered was Emily's safety. He wasn't about to let anyone take her away from him, not again. As the man stepped closer to Emily's bed, Jack stood his ground. The man's gaze flickered to him, then back to the girl. "We'll be watching," he said, his voice low, almost a warning. "But for now, she's your responsibility." Jack nodded slowly. "I'll make sure she's safe," he said, his voice hard with resolve. The man turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're playing a dangerous game, Jack," he said, before disappearing into the hallway. Jack's heart raced as he stood there, staring at the empty doorway. He had just been reminded that there was no escaping his past, no matter how hard he tried. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. Not now. Not when Emily needed him. Jack sat by Emily's hospital bed the next morning, his mind still buzzing from the encounter with the man from the Hells Angels. The warning hung in the air like a cloud, its presence undeniable. The man had made it clear, the club was watching, and it wasn't just Emily's safety that was at risk now. Jack's past was starting to bleed through, threatening everything he was trying to build for her. He had always known that leaving the club wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't anticipated it to follow him so quickly. The door to Emily's room opened, and Jack's gaze snapped to it. The doctor entered, looking at his clipboard, unaware of the storm brewing in Jack's mind. He was still processing the conversation with the Hells Angels member, and every word seemed to echo in his head. "How is she?" Jack asked, trying to focus on the here and now, his eyes fixed on the doctor. The doctor smiled, but there was an underlying concern in his eyes that Jack didn't miss. "She's doing much better," the doctor said. "The wound is healing nicely. We should be able to discharge her in a few days." Jack nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had to figure out what to do next. Emily needed stability, and he wasn't sure he could provide that while the club was still lurking in the shadows. "Thank you, doctor," Jack said, standing up from his chair as the doctor left the room. The weight of his decision to leave the Hells Angels had never felt heavier. He had hoped, even for a brief moment, that he could walk away clean. But the reality was clear now. Once you were in, there was no getting out. As Jack sat back down, Emily stirred in her bed, her small form shifting under the blankets. She looked up at him, her eyes a little brighter than before, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice still raspy but filled with concern. Jack's heart tightened. "I'm fine, kid," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But Emily wasn't buying it. She had seen too much, too young. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, and Jack knew she could see through the act. She had been through enough pain to recognize it in others. "You don't have to protect me," she said, her voice steady. Jack swallowed hard, surprised by the maturity in her words. "I'm not trying to protect you, Emily. I'm just trying to figure things out." She looked at him, her expression softening. "You don't have to do it alone." Jack felt a pang in his chest. She was right. He had been trying to handle everything on his own for so long, always thinking he was protecting others by keeping them at arm's length. But here was this little girl, someone who had lost everything, offering him something he hadn't realized he needed: connection. "You've got a lot of fight in you," Jack said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. "I think you'll be just fine." She smiled back, and for the first time in days, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he wasn't as broken as he thought. Maybe there was still a chance for both of them. But as the minutes passed, the weight of the club's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Jack found himself outside the hospital, standing in the cool night air. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket as he stared out into the darkness, lost in thought. He knew he couldn't outrun the Hells Angels. They would find him eventually. They always did. But there had to be a way to keep Emily safe. He couldn't let her fall back into the hands of those who had abandoned her. As Jack stood there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. It was Rick. "Jack, you're not fooling anyone." Rick's voice came through the phone, cold and mocking. "You think you can walk away from the club? You're just setting yourself up for failure." Jack's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Rick?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with warning. "You know what I want," Rick replied. "You can't just turn your back on us, Jack. You're still one of us. You always will be. You can't protect her from what's coming. No one can." Jack's grip on the phone tightened, his fingers nearly crushing it. "Stay away from her," he growled, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "She's got nothing to do with this." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jack could almost hear Rick smirking. "You really think you can save her? You've already made your choice, Jack. You've chosen her over us. And that means there's a price to pay." Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to acknowledge the truth in Rick's words. But deep down, he knew Rick was right. The Hells Angels wouldn't let him go without a fight. And this time, it wouldn't just be about him. Emily was now a part of this world, and they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "You'll regret this." Rick's voice came through the phone one last time before hanging up. Jack stood there, staring at the screen, his chest tight with anxiety. He had made his choice, but now, the consequences were starting to catch up with him. There was no turning back now. Jack had to protect Emily, and he would do whatever it took, no matter the cost. The next morning, Jack stood outside the hospital, staring at the sky as the early morning sun began to break through the clouds. The warning from Rick still echoed in his mind, and he knew that time was running out. Emily was still recovering, but Jack could feel the weight of the looming threat pressing down on him. The Hells Angels weren't going to let him walk away so easily, and now, with Emily caught in the crossfire, Jack was more determined than ever to protect her. He hadn't realized how much he had come to care for her until now. She had been through so much in her short life, and Jack couldn't bear the thought of letting her down. As he looked out at the empty parking lot, he knew he couldn't stay at the hospital forever. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that someone from the club would find them. Jack needed to get Emily somewhere safe, somewhere far from the reach of the Hells Angels. But where could they go? Jack had no family left, no one to turn to. He had cut ties with everyone in his past. He was alone. Emily stirred in her bed behind him, and Jack turned to see her sitting up, her tired eyes looking at him with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice still weak from the injuries she had sustained. Jack forced a smile and walked over to her side. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "Just thinking." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're worried about something," she said. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to say. He didn't want to scare her, but she was smarter than most kids her age. She had been through things that no child should ever have to experience. "It's nothing," he said finally, forcing the words out. "Just need to figure out what to do next." Emily didn't press him further, but Jack could tell she wasn't convinced. She had a way of reading people, of understanding things without them saying a word. It was one of the things that made her so different from other kids. Jack sat down beside her, and they sat in silence for a few moments. He wanted to tell her everything. The truth about the Hells Angels, the threat Rick had made, but he couldn't bring himself to. Not yet. Emily deserved to have a little peace, even if just for a while. "Hey," Jack said, breaking the silence. "I'm going to take you somewhere today. Somewhere safe." Emily looked at him with curiosity. "Where?" she asked. Jack smiled. "It's a surprise," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "But first, I need you to promise me something." Emily raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Promise me you'll trust me," Jack said. "I won't let anything happen to you, no matter what." Emily nodded, her eyes softening. "I promise," she said quietly. Jack felt a pang in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that, how much he needed to believe it himself. But he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Emily was relying on him, and he wasn't going to let her down. A few hours later, after a quiet breakfast in the hospital room, Jack helped Emily gather her things. They were leaving, and there was no looking back. Jack knew the Hells Angels wouldn't stop until they had him, and he couldn't risk bringing them any closer to Emily. As they left the hospital, Jack glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone from the club lurking in the shadows. But for now, they were safe. Jack had no idea where they were going next, but he knew it had to be far away from this town. He couldn't stay on the run forever, but for now, he would do whatever it took to keep Emily safe. The ride was long, and the weight of their situation pressed heavily on Jack's shoulders. But as they drove further from the town, Jack allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. They were getting closer to freedom, closer to a life without fear. They stopped at a small diner about an hour outside of town. It was a quiet place, the kind of spot where people came to escape the world for a while. Jack and Emily sat in a booth by the window, and Jack ordered them both a meal. As they ate, Jack tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone from the club was following them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But for now, they were safe. The world outside seemed peaceful, and for the first time in days, Jack allowed himself to relax. As they finished their meal, Emily looked up at him. "Where are we going next?" she asked, her voice soft. Jack hesitated. He didn't have an answer. He had no plan, no destination, no idea what to do next. But he knew one thing for sure. He would keep running if that's what it took to protect her. He looked out the window, watching the sun beginning to set, and he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what came next, he would keep Emily safe. He would never let her down. The next few days felt like a blur to Jack. He and Emily had been on the road, constantly moving, always looking over their shoulders. They stayed at motels along the way, never staying in one place too long. Jack had always been good at running, but now it was different. He wasn't running from the law or rival gangs. He was running to protect Emily. She was all that mattered now. As they pulled into yet another small town, Jack felt the familiar sense of unease. He parked the car in the motel lot, keeping his eyes on the street as they got out. The town was small, quiet, maybe too quiet. Jack didn't like it. He didn't like being exposed. But Emily needed rest, and she was exhausted from all the traveling. They had to stop somewhere, even if only for a night. As they entered the motel lobby, the clerk behind the counter gave them a polite but uninterested look. Jack could tell she didn't care who they were or what they were doing. She was just doing her job. "One room for the night," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. The clerk nodded and handed him the key. "Room 6. It's on the left." Jack took the key, his hand brushing against the cold metal. He turned and made his way toward the room, Emily following close behind. The room was small but clean, a single bed with a faint smell of bleach in the air. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jack set down their bags and locked the door behind them. Emily immediately went to the bed and sat down, letting out a small sigh of relief. "I'm glad we're here," she said softly, her voice tired. Jack didn't say anything at first. He was too busy scanning the room, checking the windows, making sure they were safe. But the silence between them spoke volumes. Jack wasn't sure how long they could keep running. He had no idea what kind of life he could offer her, but he knew he couldn't go back to the Hells Angels. Not now, not ever. The club had made it clear, there was no walking away. Jack's mind raced as he stood by the window, looking out at the street. It was quiet here, but Jack knew that the Hells Angels could find him anywhere. They always did. He had betrayed them, and they would make him pay. But they didn't know about Emily. They didn't know how far he would go to protect her. Jack looked over at Emily, who was lying on the bed now, her eyes closed. For the first time in a long time, she looked peaceful. Jack's heart clenched as he walked over to the bed and sat beside her. He reached out and brushed a lock of hair from her face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Emily opened her eyes and looked at him, confusion and concern in her gaze. "Sorry for what?" she asked. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight. "For everything," he said softly. "For dragging you into this. For putting you in danger." Emily shook her head. "You didn't put me in danger," she said firmly. "You're keeping me safe." Jack felt a pang of guilt. She was too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but she knew enough to see that Jack was trying his best. And that was enough for him. It was enough for now. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the motel's air conditioning filling the room. Jack's thoughts were a jumbled mess, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. He had made his choice. As the night dragged on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The calm, the stillness. He knew it wouldn't last. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before the storm. Emily finally fell asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Jack watched her for a few moments, feeling a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. The Hells Angels would catch up with him, and when they did, they would come for Emily, too. Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He had to find a way to end this. He couldn't keep running. But what choice did he have? As the night deepened, Jack stood up and moved toward the door. He needed some air, needed to think. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him softly. The cool night air hit his face as he walked toward the parking lot. His eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of danger. The streets were empty, but Jack knew better than to let his guard down. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emily. He couldn't let her go back to the Hells Angels. He wouldn't let them take her. Jack's thoughts were interrupted when a car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack froze, his heart racing. He knew that car. He recognized the headlights, the sound of the engine. It was Rick. Rick had found them. Jack's hand instinctively went to his waistband, checking for his gun. But he didn't need it. Not yet. He wasn't going down without a fight, but he wouldn't risk Emily's safety either. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. Jack stood motionless as the headlights of Rick's car cut through the dark, creeping toward the parking lot. His heart raced, his mind instantly calculating the next move. He couldn't let Emily see this, couldn't let her know how close they were to the Hells Angels catching up with them. He took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows, his back against the brick wall of the motel. The car rolled to a stop just a few feet away, and Jack's grip tightened on the handle of his knife hidden beneath his jacket. Rick got out, his figure illuminated by the streetlights, his posture as confident as ever. He looked around for a moment before locking eyes with Jack, a smirk forming on his face. "You thought you could just disappear, didn't you, Jack?" Rick's voice was low, laced with amusement. "We always find our own." Jack didn't respond immediately. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his composure. He wasn't about to give Rick the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. "What do you want, Rick?" Jack's voice was cold, the words coming out steady despite the tension in his chest. Rick chuckled, walking slowly toward him. "I'm here to make sure you don't think you can just walk away from the life, Jack," he said, his tone casual but threatening. "You think you can just hide away with the kid and pretend everything is fine?" Jack's jaw clenched. He had made the decision to leave the Hells Angels, but Rick was right. The club didn't let you go that easily. "She's not part of this," Jack said firmly. "Stay away from her." Rick's smile faded. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You really think you can protect her, Jack? You think she's safe from us?" Rick's eyes were cold, his words heavy with menace. "You made a choice, and now she'll have to pay the price too." Jack's body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to act, to make sure Rick couldn't hurt her. But he didn't. Not yet. I'm not going back, Rick. You can tell the club that, Jack said, his voice hardening. I'm done. Rick laughed, shaking his head as if Jack had said something ridiculous. You think you have a choice in this? He asked, his smile now twisted into something cruel. You're still one of us, whether you like it or not. The club doesn't just let people walk away, Jack. You should know that by now. Jack could feel the weight of Rick's words, the truth behind them. The Hells Angels didn't just let people go. The moment you walked away, you became a target. And Emily, the innocent girl who had nothing to do with this, would become a target too. Jack stepped forward, his stance shifting, his hand now resting on the knife handle beneath his jacket. He wasn't afraid of Rick. He was afraid of what the Hells Angels would do to Emily. He wasn't going to let her get caught in the crossfire. Rick's smirk only widened as he saw Jack's movement. You think you can take me on, Jack? Rick said, his voice almost mocking. You think you can take on the entire club? You're nothing without us. Jack stood still, staring Rick down, his eyes unwavering. I'm not nothing. I'm something more now, Jack said, his voice steady. And I'll fight for her. The silence between them was thick, each man sizing the other up. Rick's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it looked like he was considering something. Then, without another word, he turned his back and walked back to his car. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Was this really it? Had Rick finally decided to leave him alone? But as Rick reached the car, he stopped and turned his head slightly. You made your choice, Jack, Rick called over his shoulder. But remember, the club never forgets. We'll be watching. You can't run forever. And with that, Rick got into the car, revved the engine, and drove off into the night, leaving Jack standing there, alone. Jack's body was still tense, his mind racing with everything Rick had said. The weight of the club's threat hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Jack wondered if he had made the right decision. He had chosen to protect Emily, but at what cost? He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her down. As the sound of Rick's car faded into the distance, Jack turned and made his way back to the motel room. He needed to get Emily out of there. He wasn't sure where they would go next, but he knew it had to be far away from the Hells Angels. He couldn't keep running forever, but he would fight for as long as it took. Jack opened the door to the room, and Emily looked up from the bed. She could see the tension in his face, the worry in his eyes. She knew something had happened. Is everything okay? She asked, her voice soft and unsure. Jack nodded, but his mind was far from at ease. We need to go, Emily, he said. We can't stay here. Emily nodded, sensing the urgency in his tone. Where are we going? She asked quietly. Jack didn't have an answer. He didn't know yet, but he did know that wherever they went, he would keep her safe, no matter what it took. The night was still, too still. Jack and Emily had driven for hours, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the car. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen, hung heavy in the air between them. Jack kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were miles away. Rick's words echoed in his head, each one a reminder that the Hells Angels wouldn't just let them go. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Jack needed a plan, but there was no clear way out. Every option seemed to have a dead end. They couldn't keep running, but they couldn't stay either. As they neared the edge of town, Jack saw a gas station up ahead. It wasn't much, but it was a place to stop, a place to think. He pulled into the lot and parked the car, cutting the engine. The sound of the silence was almost deafening as he sat there, staring out at the darkened world around him. Emily was quiet, too, her hands folded in her lap, her face tired but still carrying that quiet strength. Jack had seen it in her before, in the way she held herself, in the way she trusted him, even when everything seemed uncertain. It made him feel responsible, in a way he never had before. He wasn't just trying to save himself anymore. He was protecting her. And that responsibility felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Where are we going now? Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. Jack sighed, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. I don't know yet, he said, his voice low. We need to find somewhere safe, but I don't know where that is. Emily nodded, looking out the window. She had always been a quiet observer, taking everything in without saying much. Jack wasn't sure how much of what he was feeling she understood, but he knew she could sense the unease, the uncertainty in the air. He couldn't hide it from her, no matter how hard he tried. What happens when they find us? Emily asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. He had no idea what the Hells Angels would do, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The club didn't just let people walk away. They came for their own, no matter how much time had passed. And Jack wasn't sure how long he could protect Emily from them. We'll keep moving, Jack finally said, his voice steady despite the doubt gnawing at him. As long as we have to. Emily was quiet again, and Jack knew she was thinking about what that meant. They couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, they would have to face whatever the Hells Angels were going to throw at them. But Jack wasn't ready to think about that yet. Not when Emily was still so vulnerable. Not when he had promised to keep her safe. The flicker of a light in the distance caught his attention, and he looked up to see a car pulling into the gas station. Jack immediately tensed, instinctively scanning the vehicle. It was a small sedan, nothing particularly out of the ordinary, but something about it set off his alarm bells. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but there was no one else in sight. Just the gas station lights, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jack slowly opened his door, stepping out of the car. He walked around to Emily's side, opening the door for her. Stay close, he whispered. Something feels off. Emily didn't ask questions. She slid out of the car and followed Jack, her small steps quick and quiet. They approached the gas station's convenience store, Jack keeping a watchful eye on the car that had just pulled in. The driver wasn't getting out. They weren't sure if it was just someone stopping for gas or if they were being followed, but Jack couldn't take any chances. He moved toward the entrance of the store, pulling Emily close to him as they passed the car. The door to the store opened with a soft jingle, and they stepped inside. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced up as they entered, his attention focused on the magazine in his hands. Jack didn't care about the clerk. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. He needed to get Emily out of here, but the question was where to go next. They couldn't just keep running. Let's grab a few things, Jack said quietly, his eyes scanning the shelves. Emily nodded, her gaze flicking to the door, her instincts mirroring Jack's. She didn't feel safe here either. As they moved down the aisle, Jack heard the door jingle again. He turned, his gaze flicking toward the entrance. Two men had walked in. They were dressed casually, but Jack could tell by the way they moved, by the way they carried themselves, that they weren't ordinary travelers. He felt his blood run cold. They looked like they belonged to the same world he had tried to leave behind. The Hells Angels. Jack's hand tightened around the strap of the bag he was holding. Emily was standing next to him, her face pale, sensing the shift in the air. Jack's heart raced, and he forced himself to stay calm. The men were looking around, acting casual, but Jack could see the way they were scanning the room. They were searching for them. Jack didn't wait. He grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the back of the store, away from the men. Let's go, he whispered urgently. Emily didn't question him. She followed Jack as he moved quickly, almost running, toward the back door. He pushed open the door, his eyes darting across the dark alley behind the store. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. They had to make it out of there before the men noticed them. Jack didn't look back. He ran, pulling Emily along, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. They were in motion now, running on adrenaline, the reality of what they were up against settling over them like a dark cloud. But Jack was ready. He wouldn't stop running until Emily was safe. Jack's breath came in short gasps as he pulled Emily through the dark alley, his mind focused entirely on the sound of footsteps behind them. They had to get away, they had to outrun them, but every step felt like it could be their last. His heart hammered in his chest, and he could hear the faint echo of boots hitting the pavement, following their every move. He glanced over at Emily, her face pale but determined. She was following his lead, but he could tell she was scared. He had promised her safety, and he wouldn't let her down. Not now. Not ever. They reached the end of the alley, and Jack slowed down for a split second, scanning their surroundings. The street ahead was empty, but he knew it wouldn't be for long. They had to keep moving. Stay close, he whispered, pulling Emily into the shadows as a car drove by. The last thing they needed was attention. He waited until the car had passed, then they darted across the street, heading toward a small parking lot on the other side. Jack's mind was running a mile a minute, his instincts kicking into overdrive. They couldn't afford to get caught, not with the Hells Angels so close. He could feel their presence, the weight of their pursuit hanging over him like a storm cloud. "This way," Jack said, pulling Emily toward an old van parked near the back of the lot. He had no idea where it was going to take them, but they needed transportation. They couldn't keep running on foot. As they reached the van, Jack tried the door. It was unlocked. He didn't hesitate. He yanked it open, and they both climbed inside. Jack quickly slammed the door shut, his eyes scanning the area one last time. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. For a moment, they just sat there, the van idling in the lot, the world outside still and quiet. Then Jack hit the gas, the van lurching forward, its tires screeching as they sped away. He kept the speed low, moving cautiously through the dark streets, always aware of the road behind them. His mind raced with thoughts of what to do next, but all he knew for certain was that they had to get as far away as possible. Emily was silent beside him, her face pressed against the window, watching the world blur by. Jack couldn't blame her. He was just as lost as she was, trying to figure out what the hell was going to happen next. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He couldn't keep running forever. He had to make a stand. But how? The Hells Angels wouldn't stop. Not until they had him, and by extension, Emily. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened as he made a sharp turn, heading down a road that led out of town. He didn't know where it went, but he wasn't stopping until he found a place to think. They needed a plan. Emily stirred beside him, her voice breaking the silence. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tired but full of quiet curiosity. Jack glanced at her, his eyes softening. "I don't know, kid," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But we'll figure it out. Just keep trusting me, all right?" Emily nodded, her eyes holding a sense of quiet trust. Jack didn't know how much longer he could keep this up, but he couldn't show her that. He had to be the one who held it all together, even if he felt like he was falling apart inside. The road stretched out in front of them, dark and empty, but Jack didn't stop. They had no destination, no clear path forward, but he wasn't about to stop moving. He couldn't afford to. They were out of options, but Jack still felt like there was something, somewhere, that could help them. He just had to find it. Hours passed, the landscape changing from small towns to vast, empty stretches of highway. The farther they got from the city, the less Jack felt like they were being watched. But he knew better than to relax. The Hells Angels could be anywhere. He couldn't trust that they hadn't already caught up. After what felt like an eternity of driving, Jack saw a small gas station up ahead. It was out of the way, tucked between two hills, and it looked like the perfect place to stop for a moment. Jack pulled into the lot, keeping the van close to the building as he parked. He killed the engine and sat in the stillness for a moment. Emily was already asleep, her head resting against the window. Jack took a deep breath, running his hand over his face. The exhaustion was starting to weigh on him. He had to keep going, but even he knew that he couldn't keep running like this forever. The tension was wearing him down, and he could feel the stress in his bones. He had to get Emily somewhere safe, somewhere they could finally breathe again. He climbed out of the van quietly, making his way to the door of the gas station. It was late, and the station was empty except for a sleepy cashier who barely looked up as Jack walked inside. He grabbed a few snacks and drinks, anything to keep them going, and paid in cash. The cashier didn't ask questions, just rang him up, the transaction over in seconds. Jack returned to the van and sat for a moment before looking over at Emily. She had always been the reason he kept fighting, even when everything seemed lost. "We're going to make it, kid," Jack said softly, his voice filled with a quiet promise. "We'll get through this. Just trust me." He started the van again, pulling out of the gas station and back onto the road. There was no destination in sight, but Jack knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. He had to protect Emily. He had to keep her safe, and he would keep moving until there was no one left who could hurt her. The van's tires hummed steadily against the empty highway, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Jack's eyes flickered from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, his mind racing, but his focus was unwavering. He couldn't afford to relax, not now. Not when the Hells Angels were hunting them. Every passing mile felt like a temporary escape, a brief moment of peace that was quickly overshadowed by the looming threat. He had no destination in mind, just the need to put as much distance between them and the city as possible. He couldn't risk staying in one place for too long. Emily had fallen asleep next to him, her head resting against the window. Jack glanced over at her, her small frame curled up in the seat, her face peaceful despite everything that had happened. She was the reason he kept going, the reason he fought through the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty. He wasn't just running from the Hells Angels. He was running to keep her safe, to protect her from a life she didn't deserve. The road stretched out in front of them, empty and desolate, just like Jack felt inside. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion, every turn, every mile, just another reminder that they were constantly being hunted. The last few days had been a blur of fleeing, hiding, and trying to stay one step ahead, but Jack knew it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, they'd be found. And when they were, the Hells Angels would stop at nothing to make him pay. The question was, how long could they keep running? Jack's thoughts were interrupted when Emily stirred beside him, her small hand brushing against his arm. "Are we there yet?" she asked quietly, her voice sleepy but laced with curiosity. Jack forced a smile, glancing at her as he tried to hide the tension in his voice. "Not yet, kid," he said softly. "But we'll get there." Emily nodded, her tired eyes looking out at the passing landscape. Jack could see the unease in her expression. She knew something wasn't right. She had always been able to sense when things were off, even when Jack tried to shield her from the truth. He had promised her safety, but he was beginning to wonder if he could keep that promise. They couldn't run forever. The Hells Angels would find them, and when they did, there would be no escaping what was coming. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he turned onto a narrow road, the tires crunching over the gravel. The landscape was changing, becoming more isolated, and Jack wasn't sure whether that made him feel safer or more vulnerable. They passed a few small houses, their windows dark, no sign of life. It felt like they were in the middle of nowhere. Emily had fallen asleep again, her breathing steady. Jack let out a sigh, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his thoughts. He didn't know how long they could keep this up. They had to get somewhere, anywhere, where they could hide and regroup. He needed a plan, but he didn't have one. All he had was the will to protect Emily. They drove for hours, the miles slipping by like water through his fingers. Jack had to force himself to stay alert. They couldn't stop yet. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following them. He knew they were being hunted. He could feel it in his bones. After another hour of driving, Jack saw a small motel up ahead. It wasn't much, just a single-story building with a neon sign that flickered on and off. It looked run down, but it would do. They needed a place to rest, to regroup. Jack pulled into the parking lot, his eyes scanning the area as he parked. He didn't trust anyone, especially not in places like this. He wasn't sure how much longer they had before the Hells Angels found them, but he wasn't going to let Emily see his fear. He climbed out of the van, closing the door gently so as not to wake her. The cool night air hit him as he walked to the motel's office. The place was quiet, eerily so. Jack didn't like it. He pushed open the door, and the bell above it jingled. The woman behind the counter looked up, her expression tired but friendly. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft. Jack kept his tone casual. "One room for the night," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded and handed him a key, not asking any questions. "Room 3. It's just down the hall." Jack took the key and turned, walking back to the van. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They couldn't stay here long, but they needed a place to rest, to figure out their next move. He opened the van door and leaned inside. "We've got a room for the night," he said softly, shaking Emily awake. She blinked up at him, rubbing her eyes. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "For now," he said, his voice reassuring but not convincing. Emily didn't argue. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. They grabbed their things and headed into the motel. Jack kept his eyes on the shadows, his senses on high alert. The room was small but clean, just a simple bed and a small bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was enough for tonight. Jack locked the door behind them and sat down on the bed, his mind still racing. Emily curled up beside him, her head resting against his chest. For a moment, everything felt quiet, peaceful. But Jack knew it wouldn't last. The Hells Angels would come for them. He just didn't know when. And that uncertainty ate at him, gnawing at his insides. He had to protect her. He had to keep her safe. And he would fight for as long as it took. The night dragged on, the silence of the motel room pressing down on Jack like a weight he couldn't escape. Emily was asleep next to him, her small body curled up tightly under the blanket. She had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from the constant motion, from the never-ending fear of being discovered. Jack, on the other hand, couldn't sleep. He kept his eyes on the door, listening for any sound that might signal danger. He couldn't relax, not with the Hells Angels so close. They had found him once. It was only a matter of time before they found him again. He didn't know how he could protect Emily for much longer. The weight of that responsibility was suffocating. As the minutes turned to hours, Jack's thoughts turned darker. The constant running, the fear of being caught, it was wearing him down. He had promised Emily safety, but now he wasn't sure how long he could keep that promise. The Hells Angels had made it clear. They didn't let anyone walk away. Jack had been a part of their world for too long, and he had a feeling they were going to make him pay for it. But no matter what, he couldn't let them hurt Emily. He wouldn't. The thought of them getting to her, of putting her through the same things he had seen in his life, sent a surge of anger through him. They wouldn't touch her. He'd die before that happened. Jack stood up, pacing the small room, trying to clear his head. His mind was spinning with thoughts of what to do next. He had to get them both out of here, but where would they go? The money he had wasn't enough to disappear for long. And without a plan, they would just be running indefinitely. He needed help, but he had no one left to turn to. His old connections had either turned their backs on him or were dead. The people who could have helped him were long gone, and he was left with nothing but the empty feeling in his gut. He couldn't think about that now. Emily needed him, and that was all that mattered. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had to focus. He couldn't afford to fall apart. Slowly, he made his way to the window and peeked through the blinds. The parking lot outside was empty. He couldn't see anything suspicious, but he knew better than to trust that everything was quiet. It was always the calm before the storm. Jack turned back to Emily, his heart heavy with guilt. She had been through so much already, and he hadn't been able to protect her from any of it. He had brought her into this life, a life filled with violence and danger. He had promised to keep her safe, but all he had done was lead her deeper into the chaos. And now, it was too late to turn back. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration building inside him. He didn't know what to do. He was out of options. But then, a thought struck him. There was one person he could reach out to. One person who might still be able to help. He didn't want to involve anyone else in this, but he had no choice. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. The contact he had in mind wasn't someone he trusted fully, but he was the only one who could help them now. Jack took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang a few times before it was answered. Jack, the voice on the other end said. It was gravelly, a voice Jack hadn't heard in years. I thought I'd never hear from you again. Jack gritted his teeth. I need your help, he said, his voice low. I'm in trouble. There was a pause on the other end, and Jack could feel the skepticism radiating through the phone. Trouble, huh? The voice said. You never did listen to the rules, did you, Jack? Jack tightened his grip on the phone, trying to keep his temper in check. I don't have time for this, he snapped. I'm on the run, and I've got someone with me, someone who's in danger. The voice on the other end grew quieter, more serious. You've got a kid with you? Jack nodded, even though the person couldn't see him. Yeah, he said, his voice softening. She's been through too much already. I can't protect her alone. The other end of the line was silent for a moment. Then the voice spoke again, this time more carefully. All right, I'll help you. But this is the last time, Jack. After this, we're done. You got that? Jack didn't hesitate. I understand, he said. Just tell me what to do. The voice on the other end gave him some directions, and Jack felt a small spark of hope flicker in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He had to get to the location, but it would buy them some time, a place to hide for a while. Stay where you are for now, the voice continued. I'll get in touch when it's time. And Jack, don't trust anyone. Not even me. Jack nodded, even though he knew the person couldn't see him. I won't. Thanks. He hung up the phone and exhaled, the tension not fully lifting but easing a little. He turned to Emily, who had woken up and was now sitting up, rubbing her eyes. You okay? She asked, her voice still a little groggy. Jack nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, kid. I think we've got a plan. But we need to be ready to move fast. Emily nodded, sensing the urgency in his voice. She didn't ask questions. She trusted him, and that was all he needed. We'll be ready, she said quietly. Jack couldn't help but feel a swell of pride in his chest. She was strong, even at her young age. stronger than he had been at that age. Maybe they'd make it after all. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon. Jack and Emily had been on the road for hours, their minds running in different directions, their thoughts heavy with uncertainty. The air was thick with tension, but Jack's grip on the wheel had steadied. They were nearing the place the voice on the phone had directed him to, a secluded location that he hoped would give them a moment to breathe. The world outside the van felt as empty as his mind, the road stretching on endlessly in front of them. It had been a long journey, physically and mentally, but it wasn't over yet. Every mile brought them closer to a new chapter, a new chance for safety, but also closer to the truth he was trying to avoid. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror every few moments, expecting to see headlights following them. He knew the Hells Angels were still hunting him, but now, with Emily in tow, it felt like they were being hunted more than ever. He couldn't let them find her. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. His hands gripped the wheel tighter as they took a sharp turn, heading deeper into the countryside. The voice on the phone had said to go down this road, that they'd find help at the end of it. Jack wasn't sure what to expect, but he had to trust it. He had no choice. They couldn't run forever. The world outside the van was getting more isolated, the trees and fields stretching out in all directions. There were no other cars on the road, no signs of life for miles. It was a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Emily, who had been silent for most of the drive, looked up from her seat and gave Jack a soft smile. "Are we close?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jack nodded, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, kid. We're almost there." Emily nodded and leaned back in her seat, her small hands folded in her lap. She had been through so much already, but there was a calmness about her now, a trust in Jack that he didn't deserve but couldn't help but feel grateful for. He had promised her safety, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he thought he might be able to deliver on that promise. As they rounded the corner, Jack's eyes caught sight of something in the distance. A small, weathered house stood alone in a clearing, surrounded by overgrown grass and trees. It looked abandoned, but Jack had no doubt that this was the place. His heart quickened, a mix of relief and anxiety flooding his chest. He pulled the van into the overgrown driveway, the wheels crunching over the gravel. The house loomed ahead, its porch dark and empty. Jack hesitated for a moment, his mind racing, but Emily's quiet voice broke his thoughts. "This is it, right?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Yeah, kid. This is it." They both got out of the van, Jack keeping a close eye on their surroundings. The house seemed deserted, the air still, but Jack wasn't taking any chances. He led Emily to the front door, his hand resting on the handle, ready to act if needed. As he knocked, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a man in his late 40s. He had a weathered face, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Jack," the man said, his voice low but steady. Jack nodded in greeting. "We need your help." The man stepped aside, allowing them in. The inside of the house was small, sparsely furnished, but warm and inviting. Jack had expected something more run-down, more like the abandoned houses he had seen in the past. But this place had a different feel. The man led them to a small room at the back, where a fire was crackling in the hearth. It felt safe, for the first time in a long time. "Sit down," the man said, motioning to the chairs around the table. Jack and Emily took their seats, and the man walked to the stove, filling a kettle with water. "I've got some things to sort out, but you're safe here for now," he said, his voice calm. Jack watched him closely, trying to read the man's intentions, but there was no sign of hostility in his demeanor. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his tone guarded. The man glanced at him over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Let's just say I owe you one. A long time ago." Jack's brow furrowed, trying to place the face, but it wasn't familiar. He didn't ask any more questions, though. He needed answers, but not now. Right now, he needed to focus on keeping Emily safe. The man set the kettle on the stove and then took a seat across from them. "You're in a tough spot, Jack," he said, "but I can help you. It won't be easy, but I can get you out of here, out of their reach." Jack leaned forward, his eyes hard. "How?" The man's gaze flicked over to Emily, who had her head down, fiddling with her hands. "I've got connections. People who can help you disappear. But it's not just about running. You need to lay low, stay off the radar. They'll come for you. But if you're careful, you might be able to slip away for good. Jack's mind raced, considering the options. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And what's the cost? He asked. The man shrugged. Everything has a price, Jack. But I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing this because I know what it's like to be hunted. And because I owe you. Jack nodded slowly. All right, we'll take it. The man stood up, moving toward the door. I'll get things set up for you. But you need to be ready. It won't take long for them to realize you're gone. Jack stood as well, his eyes hardening. We'll be ready. As the man left the room, Jack turned to Emily, who was looking up at him with wide eyes. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. They might just make it out of this. He wasn't sure how, but he was going to protect her, no matter what. Jack had finally found a way forward, and it felt like the first step toward freedom. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The Hell's Angels would come for them, and when they did, Jack would be ready. He had no choice. Emily was counting on him. In this gripping tale of survival and danger, Jack finds himself on the run after breaking free from the dangerous world of the Hell's Angels. As he tries to protect a young girl, Emily, who has already faced more than her fair share of hardship, Jack is constantly hunted by the Hell's Angels, and their pursuit is relentless. These thrilling Hell Angels stories take us through Jack's harrowing journey, his struggle to escape the life he once knew, and the difficult choices he faces to keep Emily safe. The deeper Jack gets into hiding, the more he realizes that no matter how far he runs, the Hell's Angels will always find a way to track him down. As the tension builds, we see the lengths Jack will go to protect the one person who still believes in him. With each twist and turn, these Hell Angel stories bring readers to the edge of their seat as they discover what happens when someone tries to escape the life of crime and violence. Will Jack find a way to keep Emily safe, or will the Hell's Angels catch up with them? These stories offer an intense look into the world of the Hell's Angels, filled with suspense, danger, and moments of unexpected hope. Don't miss the next chapter of these thrilling Hell Angel stories, where survival is the only option and redemption is a long shot.